Okay, so I'm just going to now introduce you to Mark, who's the person you really been wanting to hear from this evening. Okay, Mark Fellows is Professor of Ecology at the University of Reading and a natural historian since childhood. Much of his research focuses on human-wildlife interactions, particularly in urban areas, investigating how urbanization affects the abundance and distribution of species. He's appeared widely in the media discussing urban wildlife, and he's written 4 volumes in the well-known 30-second series of popular science books. His current research projects include work on cat predation in Nigeria, grackles in the USA, macaws in Brazil, and sloth bears in India. But this talk is all about British gardens. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I'm going to hand you over to Mark. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. And I'm going to try and share my screen. And while I do that, let me make sure I get the right screen. And I am hoping that you have that. Is that visible?
Not yet, no.
Not yet. Well, then I will try that again. Apologies, everybody. The joys of using Zoom when you're not using Zoom. There we go. While I'm doing that and kind of wittering on, what you should see then is that's a Galapagos hawk, if anybody's interested.
Yep, that's fine now.
There we go. Right. So I was going to say that the library is fantastic. When I was an undergraduate in London, I used to use it quite a lot. It was really helpful. I was doing a zoology degree and it was just around the corner, so it was all very helpful. Anyway, onto the substantive bit. So I grew up in the west of Ireland, and I was lucky enough to grow up in this very small town, large village that still had corn crakes around it, you know, when I first started getting interested in birds, but those numbers declined very rapidly. I used to go out counting skylarks and mapping skylark territories. All that area now is under housing. It's all housing estates, and that's not untypical of much of what's happening in the world. You know, we know as human populations have grown that the amount of pristine habitats has declined, and much has become either agriculture. And of course, over the last 100 years or so, we've seen this massive increase in the degree of urbanization. And these urban ecosystems, people have realized are really novel, they're really interesting, and they provide different ways of us understanding how people and wildlife can interact. And part of the reason they're so important is that today, more than half of people on the planet live in towns and cities and urban areas. In the UK, it's, depending on how you measure urban areas, somewhere between 80 and 90% of people live in urban areas. And these areas are not like typical habitats in many ways. They're hugely fragmented. You've got lots of artificial habitats, you've got lots of disturbance, the temperature is different, the soil is compacted, you've got species that are introduced and novel that wouldn't be found in other areas, especially in garden plants. We've got species like grey squirrels and parakeets that have been introduced. And it's where people come into contact with wildlife. And I've picked this is just a fairly typical area of suburban sprawl in the southeast of England. And I've picked this simply because I happen to live on the west of this, of this sprawl. But it kind of captures what urban areas are like. You know, lots of suburbia, it's gardens, green patches, playing fields, some lakes and recreational areas. But there's a lot of biodiversity, as anybody, you know, especially people in London will know that many of the urban areas that are there contain massive amounts of biodiversity. But the key reason for me this is so important that we study urban ecosystems is because it's where people come into contact with nature. And the choices we make affect urban diversity. And I'm just going to go through a few examples. These are from various papers we've published over the years. And some of it's really simple. So how much green space you have, what's the contiguous area of green space determines which species are there. So you think of urban moles, they need around 10 hectares for a population to persist. If it gets to be more compacted than that, if it gets more fragmented, you lose your moles. If you take your lawns and instead of having grass on your lawn, you put flowering plants, you can massively change the amount of biodiversity that's there. So here's an experiment we did doing just that, trying to look at a much more biodiverse lawn area, and given that lawns cover so much of gardens, you can see why this is important. On the top is a figure that shows the relationship between the insects coming in, the bees and wasps, and the flies coming into the grass patches. That little bar, I hope you can see it, is one pollinator. If you replace that same area with flower-rich lawn replacement plants, you can see the diversity that's there. There's over 45 different species of pollinators in those patches, and they're much more complex, much more like a normal web of interaction. So how we choose to manage that habitat makes a difference, and it affects the interactions between species. So if you think about it, you know, the plants that we put out there and how we manage that habitat absolutely affects how species interact. So in urban areas, if you go to the centre of London, I'm pretty certain that if you find aphid populations on plants in more central areas of London, they're going to have more mutualistic interactions because there's more ants in those areas. As you go to the outer suburbs, you lose the ants, you get more predator-prey interactions. The patterns change quite surprisingly. So key ecological interactions change with urbanization and change because of how we manage areas. So we can change the size of the areas we have, we can change the plants that are there, that will affect ecological interactions. We can we can make choices about where our pets roam. So there's some work we've done that's not published yet that shows that, of course, hardly surprisingly, that if you go into urban parks and surrounding areas, that if you have dogs going for walks, that increases disturbance to wildlife massively compared to people walking on their own. And many people have pet cats. I've seen in some of the pictures. And pet cats, of course, are predators, and they will kill birds, and their numbers, the numbers of cats that are found, correlates with human density. So as we live in urban areas, we introduce all of these predators. And we do other things. We provide nest sites for birds in urban areas. And so this is just a woodcrete box in my own back garden. And if you look at what happens there, that, you know, when we put nest boxes out, what we tend to do is favor some species over others. So the community structure of birds that are found in urban areas is affected by the provision of nest sites, because small hole nesting birds like blue tits and great tits, and these days one or two others, are starting to benefit, or have benefited greatly, from the provision of nest boxes. But also, by nesting in urban areas, birds are a little bit different. Many of them in the nests we looked at, and blue tits and great tits, use anthropogenic material, and particularly great tits, the more urban the area was, the more anthropogenic material they used in the nest. So rather than using natural materials, they were finding human-made fibers and using those in their nests. And we found that seemed to be associated with an increase in parasite load for the birds. But quite clearly, with increased urbanization, we found a decrease in the number and diversity of insects living in nests with birds. So not just parasites. So we're changing the ecology in nests, and by providing nests, we're changing the community of birds that are present. So this is, of course, about garden bird feeding, but what I really want to do is sort of put it in the context of a lot of change in urban areas, and that change is largely driven by us, by people who are resident in those homes. So here's again a fairly typical picture of urban sprawl in the UK. We live in a very horizontal way in this country. Lots of single family occupied homes with domestic gardens, and often parking spaces out the front. That's pretty common, even in relatively densely populated areas like London. And so, you know, in terms of households in the UK, around 90% of households have a garden. And the reason I think this is so fascinating is because every one of those people interacts with nature. How they choose to manage that garden has an effect on nature in that urban area, and how they work together to do that. If people make similar choices for good or ill, it has an effect on biodiversity. And it was really interesting. I didn't know the poll was going to be run earlier, so I was really interested to see that. And I noted it down. 81% of the people who were in the audience and filled in the poll feed birds. That's almost double the national average rate. Now, depending on which survey you do, you get slightly different numbers coming out. the percentage there is from our own surveys in Reading. Around 45% of households feed birds at one point or another, and many of those people, of course, feed birds regularly. So if you think of the millions of households in the UK, the millions of gardens, and then the millions of people feeding birds in their gardens, what we've got is this huge ecological experiment going on in people's back gardens. And I find that fascinating. It's in itself, each individual person feeding is probably not making much of a difference to what's going on in their local area. But when cumulatively you have a lot of people doing that, it makes there's a real potential for interesting change going on there. So the rest of this talk is just sort of illustrating some of the bits that we found interesting when we were doing our research. So I'm just pulling out one or two stories from that, but they do kind of hang together and relate to each other. So I'll start off with calories, and I wanted to mention that not all bird feeding happens in the UK or the US. It's a global phenomenon. This picture was taken in the high Andes, where you'll see lots of sugar water feeders for hummingbirds. You'll see similar things in California and various other areas. And so wherever you go around the world, people do feed birds. It's just that in some countries, it's a massive, massive industry. And I did see in the chat, I didn't know who said it, but there was a comment about where sunflower seeds come from and the role of the Ukraine in terms of being a major source of that. You know, clearly large amounts of agricultural land is used in producing food for garden birds. Now these data are old, but they give you an indication of the size of the industry that's associated with garden bird feeding. So back in 2006, the USA that spent almost $3.5 billion on feeding garden birds. I find that a tremendous amount and quite mind-blowing, to be honest. In the UK, the last good data I had was from 2010. It was over 200 million. I've seen various other figures, around 250 million pounds more recently spent on bird food in the UK. And that's hardly surprising. I mean, anybody who chooses to visit a garden centre, you will see that there are shelves full of the paraphernalia and the food for feeding birds. You go to your local, if I go to my local Sainsbury's, I can find peanuts for birds and various seeds for birds. So it's a huge industry because so many people are doing it. And I love this. I found this paper, I read this paper when it first came out, and I really, really liked it. So it's by Kate Plummer, who works for the BTO. And she led, and her and her team looked at bird feeding and how it affected what's going on in gardens. And to study the change in how people were feeding birds, they went and looked at the adverts in things like RSPB Bird magazine and saw how those adverts changed over time. Now, when I started feeding birds back in, I guess I probably would have been about 7 or 8, so it would have been the mid to late 70s. I would have to go to the local supermarket, sort of whatever version of supermarket was near me at the time, and buy trill, which is this bird seed that you use to feed things like budgies. And that was fantastic. That was the bird seed that and it worked really well. In the 70s and 80s, it was peanuts, it was single seed mixes, some oats, you know, not much that was there at all. But then various different seed mixes came in, live food came in, fat balls, Niger seeds, sunflower hearts. I mean, the cost of sunflower hearts, my goodness, suet pellets, finch, you know, all of these things. You can see this massive growth in diversity because the market is matured. It is a big industry. And it also shows how people have engaged with it, because as more food has been there, more people feed. And the Pet Food Manufacturers Association, hardly surprisingly, recommend that people feed birds all the year around. Again, when I started feeding birds, you fed birds in the winter. And that's how it started. You know, back in the late 1800s, there was a series of cold winters in England. And there was this sort of newspaper campaign to start people feeding birds in their gardens. And it kind of started there and spread and became what it is today. But there it was about feeding birds in winter. And I think it was really around the late 80s and early 90s where people started shifting away from just feeding birds in the winter. So we've got all this food going out there. It's massive amounts of food going into our urban ecosystems. And the question is, does it matter? Does it matter to the species that are there? And the evidence is actually, you know, it is there, but it's surprisingly not as strong as you'd think. So you'd think that you're feeding birds and it's going to have this great effect on the fitness of birds. They're going to live longer, have more offspring. Certainly if you feed birds, it does help them become, they generally have more fat reserves. They're a bit healthier. There's studies that show that. There aren't that many studies that show it increases survivorship. And there aren't that many studies that show it increases the number of offspring that survive. You generally have to provide the right type of food for that to happen. But there is evidence that it does benefit birds. We also know it's changing how they evolve. That's quite fantastic. That story of what's happened with people have worked out over the last sort of 10, 15 years about blackcaps, about how they've changed their migration patterns from Central and Northern Europe to coming west to us because of bird food that we're providing. Blackcaps and fat balls are generally coming, aren't our summer residents. They're birds that are migrating into us, and those patterns of migration have changed and evolved because of the provision of food. We know that some species really are badly affected by disease when you get outbreaks, notably greenfinches. Their populations declined rapidly because of disease outbreaks, and that's been seen in other countries as well. But those outbreaks are fortunately, relatively few and far between, but when they happen, they can have these massive effects. And also, surprisingly, given all the food that's put out, urban birds, and again, our data supports what many other studies have shown, which is that clutch sizes of great tits and blue tits in urban areas are significantly smaller than those that are in on the sort of peri-urban areas on the periphery of the town or the city, or into more rural areas. So we're still not clear about this. And what I should say is that despite the fact that millions of people feed birds and the amount of money that's spent on it, there's surprisingly few studies on all of this, which is why I found it interesting. But I want to come back once more to Kate Plummer's paper, because it does show something really important, and that is that we know that bird numbers have changed rapidly in urban areas over the past few decades. There's been some losers like house sparrows and starlings and song thrushes, but there's been some real winners like wood pigeons and collared doves. But some of the more important ones are things like goldfinches, which of course, when I started feeding birds, didn't come into gardens and didn't really feed on feeders. But today, it's one of those birds that's quite commonly seen in a garden. I remember the first time I saw reed buntings in somebody's garden feeding on seed that was provided. So you've got these changes in diversity that are happening, and certainly the birds that use feeders are seeing more population growth in urban areas than those birds that don't. So that's Kate Plummer's work, and that's really excellent, and it's well worth a read. So we were interested in just asking what people were doing, because surprisingly, when we did this, nobody had asked the question quite like this before. That people have been asked how often they feed, a bit like this, and when they feed, but not what they feed. So when we asked people in Reading when they fed and how often they fed, 2/3 of people said that they fed all year round. 1/3 of people said that they fed only in autumn and winter. A tiny handful said they fed only in the spring and summer. And generally, the majority of people had food out most of the time when we asked them. And certainly the majority had food out at least weekly for birds in their gardens. So that was interesting. Knowing that 2/3 of people were feeding year round, and we were interested though in how much food was actually going from feeders into the ecosystem. That's the bit that nobody knew before this. So we had volunteers. We had around 30 people, and the number at any given time varied from 20 to sort of 27 people. So it's not a huge number of people, but it's quite difficult to find people who are willing to measure out every single bit of food that they're going to put out for birds in their gardens for a couple of years. And we found, first of all, there was no obvious seasonal trend. These were people who fed all year round. We'd thought that more food would go out in the winter than in the summer, but we didn't see that. But what was interesting was the sheer volume of food that went out, which is just extraordinary. So a couple of tons. So you've got a couple of dozen people, I should say, here. So over 2 years. So they were putting out a couple of tons of mixed seed, almost a ton of scraps, which surprised me. I don't think of people feeding birds putting out scraps these days, but people were. People putting out fresh fruit, including from their own fruit trees that they'd leave there. A couple of 100 kilos of sunflower hearts, more than 100 kilos of fat blocks and balls, 100 kilos, more than 100 kilos of peanuts. So huge amounts. So perhaps 3 tons or so, 2 to 3 tons for those people of food was going out over a 2-year period, which is I just found was absolutely extraordinary, the volume of food that was going into gardens. That is a real natural experiment. And so we tried to work out, how much food is how many birds could this support. And the reality, of course, is that the group of people we had as volunteers are likely to be at the more extreme end. So we took the most conservative estimate that we could with this, and we were looking at roughly around 100 calories of food per day per garden was going out. And birds don't need many calories to survive. And if you just do a back of the envelope calculation, it was enough food to feed 31 million of our 10 most common garden bird species, so around 40% of their population. So plenty of food going out there. If we took the upper estimate, it would be enough to feed almost 200 million birds. So that's clearly unlikely. At the same time, though, I'd say that not all the food, of course, goes into birds, and that's really important. And I'll come to that in a moment. But just to give you an idea what a couple of tons of bird food looks like, that's Hugh. He did some of the work that I talk about in this. He was one of a member of our group at the time, and this is for an experiment that I'll talk about later that we did locally to look at the effect of bird feeding. So that's a couple of tons of bird food looks like. And so the question really is, you've got this massive addition of resource. What are the consequences of doing that? So people feed a lot more than you think, and therefore there must be consequences, one would think. And I have to confess, a lot of when I do think about garden bird feeding experiments, I usually think about it as I stare out the window of my own house, or certainly looking through glass anyway. This is a few years old. This is a sunflower seed feed, sunflower seeds. It's mixed seed and peanuts, and you can see each of them as a squirrel feeding on the peanuts. On the feeders. And so we feed a lot of species that don't necessarily aren't the things that people think they're feeding. Blue tits and grey tits and chaffinches and so on. So I was really fascinated to see how much of this food actually goes into other species. So part of Hugh's work involves studying grey squirrels, and so we had a series of gardens. We had over 30 gardens where we put out feeders. The feeders either had barriers around them, the sort of baffles that people use to reduce the visits of grey squirrels, or they didn't. And we had cameras following everything. So we used cameras to record all the visits by all the species to these feeders over a period of about 6 months. So it's a massive data set. And not surprisingly, I think anybody in this audience here who knows grey squirrels will not be surprised in the slightest by what's here. The first result was a really obvious one, that squirrels were actually on feeders. Nothing else fed on them. We very rarely found anything on them. So squirrels were excluding the birds that people wanted to feed from their feeders. And if you looked at the amount of time the feeders were being used, around 40% narrative study, or over 40% of the time, it was squirrels on them rather than anything else. So if you do a wild extrapolation, you could say that feeders could support the whole UK squirrel population if they fed all the food in all the feeders that fed on all the food that was in all the feeders in the country. But clearly they don't. But in urban areas, feeders could provide quite a substantial amount of food for grey squirrels. If you put guards around them, and many people who are interested in bird feeding want to know about this sort of thing, it does reduce visitation rates from squirrels. And it can, of course, prevent access completely, but birds generally don't like them either. They reduce the number of visits they make to the feeders, and I guess it's partly because they're, you've got barriers around you, so your ability to see what's around and your ability to escape might be reduced. And what was fascinating is we found hints that birds change their behaviour, in areas where there's lots of grey squirrels using food. So blue tits and great tits that tend to rely on feeders a lot tended to visit earlier. Other species that were less reliant on them tended to come later in the day, so they fed elsewhere first before seeking food on the feeders. So here we have this sort of generalist mammal that takes advantage of food that's put out for birds, and a lot of bird food probably goes elsewhere. Now, the second question, and there's three parts to this series here. So the first is the squirrels coming in. The second is, well, we've got these omnivores. You know, many are not just obligate seed feeders. They'll feed on insects, especially during the breeding season, and feed their young on insects. And so a question is, do you see a change in the number of insects around garden bird feeders? Does it change the ecology, the interactions between species? And we were interested in asking this because people have shown that if you look at the diversity and abundance of insects near nest boxes, they're reduced. And indeed, there's this fantastic piece of work going on at the moment in Belgium and the Netherlands, where they're putting up nest boxes on oak trees, where there have been outbreaks of oak processionary moth, in the hope that the predation by great tits in particular will reduce the incidence of that invasive species. But anyway, we're interested in, you know, you're putting food out, you're benefiting one group, is it having this deleterious effect on the other? And again, like many of these sorts of experiments, it's not terribly complicated to do this kind of experiment to get the data. Simply went around and compared the numbers of insects near feeders. So we looked at ground beetles and looked at areas sort of near the feeders and matched areas further away in the garden using pitfall traps. And we did that in, you know, lots of gardens. And we did similar things with pea aphids, but here we had colonies on plants. So we put in the aphids, we knew how many were there. And you had them in control gardens with no feeders or beside feeders. And you also had colonies that were protected from attack by birds. So you could see whether it was the being near a feeder or not near a feeder, or whether it was the birds that was having the effect on the dynamics. And you exposed both to foraging birds. And of course, what you find, nobody again will be startled, I'm sure, that you bring in birds to a point source, and those areas around it, you see a highly significant reductions in insect numbers. Now that's not surprising, but nobody, I'm hoping it's thought-provoking, because not many people think about some of the consequences of these things that we commonly do. Now I'm going to sort of draw these two ideas together. And this is, again, as I said, most of my ideas are triggered by looking out of panes of glass. So I was doing the washing up one day in my kitchen, looking out at a bird feeder. There was a great spotted woodpecker feeding on my feeder quite merrily. I've been given on the right-hand side of the screen is a rather flimsy nest box that I've been given as a gift. And you can see it's got this lovely barrier to stop things sort of trying to raid it. The woodpecker decided it was bored with feeding, flew off to the nest box, and it took about a minute or so before it managed to drill its way in, and it predated the nest. And I know in my gardens, if I stop feeding birds, I don't get woodpeckers coming into them. They're purely there because I'm feeding, providing food. So that led to the question of whether supplementary feeding could increase local nest predation. So it's not just that you're bringing in these birds and they're feeding on insects around. You've got species like squirrels and corvids that are also attracted into feeders. And well, can that have an effect on nest predation? And we've got to remember, of course, that you know, the majority, 2/3 in our survey of garden feeders, bird feeders, are providing supplementary food throughout the year. So we were really interested in this because, you know, you're doing something that's there for the benefit of birds, and many people who are feeding during the breeding season are trying, of course, to support the populations of their local birds. But we wondered whether, you know, inadvertently people might be doing something that might have a negative effect. So we did. Oh, and I should say, of course, in all of these, you put barriers up around, you know, if by preventing access to larger birds and grey squirrels, does that make a difference? And my confession is, you're never meant to have kind of preconceived ideas about the outcome of an experiment. I was hoping in this, because I had a kind of, you know, the woodpecker had told me that this was possible to be, you know, likely, but I'd hoped that using barriers around feeders would make all the difference, and then it would just be a nice bit of advice to people that we could give, which is why we did that. So to monitor nest predation, I mean, there's two ways of doing this experiment. You could go out and find real nests, and you can put cameras up beside them and then choose to put feeders up or not beside them. I think that would be challenging. Finding all those nests in urban Reading would be difficult. I also think it's massively ethically dubious, and I just wouldn't do it. I will say that we published this paper, and then about 2 weeks later, a paper came out from a group in the States, that was asking, actually by coincidence, you know, in 2 different continents, we were asking the same question that nobody had thought of asking in the however many years before. They did it by using, you know, real nests, and they found the same result that we found. So that was reassuring, and it made me feel quite good that I hadn't had to do something that I would have found morally on the wrong side of my lines anyway. Anyway, so we did this doing the way most people do nest predation work. You make artificial nests, and we're obviously mimicking open cup nesters, using quail eggs, a bit big, but that's what's readily available. And then we had these nests either 5 or 10 meters away from feeders, because we were trying to replicate what a sort of standard, you know, garden size would be like. And so we had the nests were either next to empty feeders, guarded peanut-filled feeders, or unguarded peanut-filled feeders. And we did, I think it was about 130 replicates in the breeding season. And each of these was monitored with a camera, so we could see everything that was coming in and visiting, and we could see what the predator was, if there was any. And we did this in suburban Reading. And so straight to the results. The solid black line there is what happens, is the nest survivorship over time if you are beside an empty feeder. So not too dissimilar to what happens in nature. Around half the nests were predated if they were near if they were near empty feeders. So that was the survivorship when there was no food around. However, if nests were near guarded or unguarded feeders, then survivorship was around 10%. So there was a massive drop in survivorship. And what was really interesting was that 5 or 10 meters didn't make a difference. Even nests that were 10 meters away from the feeders were still just as heavily predated. I mean, early on it looked like being near guarded feeders would make a difference, but over the run of the experiments, that's not what we were finding. So that was really quite a shock to us, that it was such a strong effect, and that guarding didn't make a difference. So quite clearly, and in retrospect, and again, as I say with most of these experiments, it's not terribly surprising when you think about it, that if you're attracting in species that can act as nest predators, then they're going to forage around the area. Now, in terms of the predators, the main ones were grey squirrels and magpies, and also where we do this work in Reading, jays are quite common in gardens. We're in sort of large areas surrounded by large Victorian gardens. What was really fascinating is that while the association between jays and magpie visits to feeders and nest predation was really strong, jays tend not to go to feeders. They use them very, very rarely, and certainly we didn't get them visiting, maybe 1 or 2 visits in our study. But what we found is that the number of magpies and squirrels on feeders correlated with the number of jays, and that's where the link is. So clearly jays, like all corvids, very bright birds, were looking and seeing that there was food around somewhere, so they'd come and forage in the area, and that's where they were finding the nests. But the important thing here is that people clearly want to feed birds to benefit birds, and yet one of the outcomes of this might be that actually it's not so beneficial. So I think my advice is really clear. It's that if you're going to feed birds during the breeding season, then keep it away from where other birds might be nesting. And so what we know is that, you know, supplementary feeding has pros and cons. And I want to be absolutely clear about this, because because some of the work has some negatives to it. I am hugely positive about people feeding birds, and it's because it's the most important way that people in this country engage with nature. You know, there's nothing that comes close to it. You know, it's got to be one of the biggest pastimes in the country. And as we become a really urbanized population, then how do we help you know, young people? How do we and those who have perhaps not really thought about nature before, how do we help them become engaged with nature? And you do it by providing green space, and you do it by providing experience. And feeding garden birds is a fantastic thing to do. It does absolutely has benefits for birds. You know, it does help overwinter survival. There's some evidence for offspring benefiting, and we know that species are adapting to take advantage of this, like blackcaps. But the negatives are things we can all manage. there's possible increased risk of disease transmission. It's clearly associated with feeders. Wash your feeders. That's all you need to do. Some people have argued that there's increased risk of predation at feeders by cats or sparrowhawks. No evidence for that whatsoever. And while we haven't studied sparrowhawks, we've spent a lot of time over the last few years studying cats with GPS collars and with cameras, and we find no evidence that they're using bird feeders as a place to hunt more often than anywhere else. But what we are doing is feeding large numbers of sort of generalist predators, corvids, parakeets. Whether I happen to like parakeets, some people don't, and grey squirrels. And there's consequences of that, of course. But there's also these interesting ecological consequences for species that we rarely think about, those insects and so on in the local area. And as an ecologist, I find that fascinating. It's these unexpected non-target effects. So that's where people are feeding birds and popping things out into nice expensive feeders. And I should say that I've moved on to the sort of spring-loaded weight, the ones that are limit what can feed on them by weight, because it seems to be the only thing that can control squirrels and magpies and so on in my garden. These expensive feeders, but there's other things that people feed, and that's a story that I'm sure some people will know this story. I've certainly told it on TV a few times. It's been in the press at various times. I'm still startled by it, and I'm hoping that there are people in the audience who don't know this story, because it'll be much more interesting for you. So this is the red kite, of course, and in the UK, red kites were once really common. They've always been associated with urban areas throughout history because they're predators and scavengers, and it's that scavenging behavior that people thought they were very beneficial. They help keep the streets clean. But post-medieval times, people instead moved because of what they did, accusations of them predating game birds. They were hunted, they were seen as vermin, and they were pretty much exterminated from Britain. Genetic data suggests there was perhaps only 1 or 2 breeding females in the 1930s in mid-Wales. And I'm sure most people know the fantastic reintroduction story. It's this most successful reintroduction program ever in the UK. And the first reintroduction was done in the Chiltern Hills, which of course is just about 30 odd miles, I guess, west of London. And they've done really well. They're widespread there now, they're spreading. And this again is one of those stories that comes from me staring through a window, except this time it's through the windscreen of my car. And what I noticed was that as I drove to Reading, so I live near Woking, and I've got about a 20-mile commute to the University of Reading, which is in suburban Reading. And I would drive through and I would see no kites. I'd see no kites, and then I'd go through Bracknell and I'd still see no kites, and I'd keep driving down the dual carriageway. And as I approached Reading, I'd start seeing red kites. And I'd never really thought about it. I assumed it's just this is where they are as they've been reintroduced and they're spreading. But I noticed over time the numbers that I was seeing over the houses and in the gardens was much greater than I was seeing out on the main roads. And that really surprised me. So we did some work. I had a PhD student called Mel Orris who did this work, and we did these transects through urban Reading. Now Reading itself, the conurbations, I think it's in the order of 80-90 square kilometers, so it's quite a large sort of spread out area. And she did transects with a series of volunteers through Reading, and worked out that somewhere in the region of 200 to 300, maybe even more at peak times during early summer, red kites were visiting that larger area. And that you were seeing more in the suburban areas. The peak was over areas of low density housing rather than very few in the city centre, and actually fewer just on the outskirts of town. So there was this really interesting link. And the question was why? Why are they coming in? So the first answer, of course, is are they coming into roadkill? So is it in the urban areas? There's just lots of roadkill because of all the traffic. There's lots of food waste. So on a Friday night, people are throwing away their kebabs and burgers as they go home. And on Saturday, there's plenty to eat. One of the joys of working in a university is that you've got a huge number of people who will volunteer to work with you to do their undergraduate projects. And so we had a whole series of undergraduate volunteers who surveyed a whole third of Reading's major roads to see what was there. Was there enough for red kites to feed on? surprisingly little was the answer. The councils, Wokingham and Reading Borough Council, should be proud of how clean they keep the streets. And we worked out there was enough food, you know, from roadkill and discarded human food to perhaps feed around 20 kites. So clearly not enough food to feed the numbers of kites that were there. We, as part of our bird feeding work, we were doing questionnaires, and we added some questions about red kites because we'd had a suspicion of what was going on, and we knew that in the Chilterns people had been feeding kites in their gardens. And so we asked people if they fed red kites. So this questionnaire, we covered around 1% of Reading's households, a very representative sample. And we found that over 4% of households fed red kites at one point or another. And we were absolutely blown away by this, because we knew that occasionally people fed red kites, but we just didn't know how common it was. So, I mean, just extrapolating, that's around over 4,000 households at the time fed red kites. And we've repeated this again. We repeated it again about 3 years ago. And the numbers are very similar, except the proportion of households that have fed red kites at one point or another, of course, has increased, because some people have stopped and other people have taken it up. And it's just absolutely fascinating. And I mean, COVID has kept me kind of at home a lot over the last couple of years, so I've not seen this for a while. But there were points in Reading where I think the most I ever saw was somewhere like, I think I counted 47 or 48 kites circling one house. And the image that's there has, I don't know, I guess there's around a dozen kites over a house. That's not that uncommon when people are feeding kites. And you ask people, you know, how many kites are coming to feed. The majority is just a few, you know, say 2/3 of the time it's less than 5 kites coming in. Most often it's just 1 or 2, but occasionally, you know, usually they might get 10 or more, you know, in a small number of cases. And the number of feeders where the maximum, you know, usually the maximum again was 3 to 5 you'd see coming in and feeding, but some people were getting 50 to 60 kites coming in and feeding at any one time. And having seen this, it's unlike anything apart from being in the Serengeti and watching the vultures kind of circling. There was one person I talked to as for I can't remember which show it was, but we were being filmed, and he said he just whistled and the kites knew that he was about to put food out, and they'd just come in. And he did that, you know, every other day he would feed kites. He was unusual. He fed kites much more than other people. So we asked people what they fed. They largely felt that, you know, most people fed chicken. That was by far the most common food. Some people fed chicken and they'd feed like the Sunday roast left over. So if there was some beef, lamb or pork, they'd throw that out. Some people did things you're advised not to, like throw out bacon and sausages and so on. But the vast majority, it was chicken was being fed, and most people were quite sensible. They put out a couple of handfuls of food, so under a couple of 100 grams each time they fed, and it is spectacular. Having, you know, being in a garden and watching what is a tremendously impressive bird of prey swoop down to feed is absolutely amazing. So enough food to provide, when you look at it, do the survey, if there's enough food provided by people to feed those red kites. They're now an urban bird, and people in Reading love these birds, you know, and in the local area, there's the number of industries that have the red kite in the name, from therapy and training to schools to video to upholstery cleaning, you know, electrical. It's quite impressive. They're sort of a key local symbol, but there is the opportunity for backlash. Some newspapers are quite negative about feeding birds, and they, you know, kites, they use it as a bit of a scare story, but they haven't happened too frequently more recently. So I'm going to very quickly end by talking about some unpublished work. So given that this is now going to go on YouTube, I've heard I'm going to have to get on and publish it pretty quickly. We're interested in asking what's happening across the UK with friends in the BTO. We did a national questionnaire just trying to work out the geography of where people fed. We knew it's a bias sample. We just asked people who fed birds. Had over 1,000 responses, and wherever red kites have been reintroduced, people are feeding red kites. You know, that's seen. It's not just a Chilterns thing, and it's not just a Reading thing. We're now looking to see how important that is, and we're using stable isotope analysis to allow us to do that, and that allows us to see the type of food that's going into the feathers. And these feathers that we've got were collected by local nest recorders as they go and ring the red kite. So obviously they're doing that under license, and they're collecting feathers that have fallen off the adults. They're not causing any harm to the birds whatsoever, but it allows us to get nests, you know, to geographically identify where the nests are and compare where they are compared to the density of people. So we have our kind of urban birds, those that are near towns and cities, and those then our rural birds that are further away. And then we can sample each. We do it several times because the feather grows and the diet changes, then you can kind of capture that. And at the moment, we're looking at 6 major food groups. So chicken, of course, we're interested in as our kind of measure of what people are feeding, but then we've got lamb, game birds, foxes and badgers, rabbits and worms. So a lot of that's going to be roadkill and various other deaths naturally. And just to show you some data very quickly, on the left-hand side, we have urban birds, so one from Cheltenham and one from Aberdeen. On the right, rural birds, so further away from the town, from Cheltenham again and Aberdeen. And as I said, it's early data. We haven't fully analysed it all, and we haven't published it yet. But the rural birds have no chicken signal in their feathers, whereas those in the more urban areas have high levels of chicken. Especially the Cheltenham bird had very high levels of chicken evident in the diet. So clearly people are feeding them, and it's getting into the birds, and you can work out the relative proportion of each. And the key thing is, though, that there is evidence, and it's variable, but urban birds are urban red kites are feeding on chicken, which means it's people feeding them, because these are not what's found in the wild. And so they are what we eat. They're eating the food that we're throwing away. And the people I talk to who go to Waitrose and spend a lot of money on organic chicken to feed their red kites was quite surprising as well. The kites often eat better than I do. So people are providing this high proportion of red kite calories. Lots of people in areas where their kites have fed red kites. And I'm really interested in understanding how that's kind of spread. And one of the questions, of course, is how well red kites are doing in the UK associated with the food that's being given to them. So to wrap it all up together, you know, I've sort of, my argument, I guess, my thesis is that people, you know, in urban areas, it's so important because that's where we come into contact with nature as a group. You know, the vast majority of people live in urban areas, and that's where they contact nature. And you can have that effect on nature in different ways. Some of it's accidental, how you plant and what you choose to do and how big your parks are, but some of it is deliberate. And of course, feeding birds is perhaps the most significant way we interact with nature. And it's not just blue tits and great tits and greenfinches and chaffinches and house sparrows. It's enormous birds of prey. There's nowhere else in the world that I can find that has anything like this, where people in their back gardens are feeding a massive bird of prey. It's quite an extraordinary story. We've got this collective effect, don't we, that we can all take together. And so the decisions we make about how we feed birds and the nest sites we provide and so on can all make a difference. And we're doing this, you know, we're trying to continue this elsewhere. We've got current work. My current favorite project is on these guys, these blue and yellow macaws in a city in southern Brazil, to see if we can get people to engage with providing nest sites. This isn't just a UK thing, it's a global interaction between people and nature. So that's it from me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Hopefully I'm back.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Just to think about such a huge kind of global phenomenon, and I mean the numbers of people involved and the size of the industry was astounding, really. I think I probably hadn't appreciated quite how big the scale was. And the story about the kites is absolutely fantastic. And I'm really interested, and I think other people will be, in that new study, looking at the kind of, you know, tracking the impact of the diet and looking at the feathers. I think that it'll be really, you know, already you've kind of indicated what that's showing, but, you know, just kind of thinking about huge impact that these kind of activities are having, and that, you know, starting to think about that in global ways as well. And I like the way you were stressing the importance of this is in terms of urban people interacting with nature. It's obviously a very, you know, very key, and any kind of discussion and thinking about advising about it, I think really needs to bear that very much in mind. So we've had a few questions coming through. A couple of sort of like practical things I think that people are interested in. So one is about how do you stop mice and rats eating bird food, and people have suggested various things, but I don't know if because you were constantly talking about other kinds of generalists that are attracted, but didn't really talk about mice and rats. So have you kind of done any studies on that or get any advice for people?
When we started doing this, we thought that would be a major focus of what we were doing. Where we do our work, we don't get any coming. We hardly ever get any mice coming up to the feeders and feeding, and we don't get rats. And I wonder if it's something to do with the nature of the suburbia where we're doing our work and the gardens where we are. I certainly know in my own garden where I am now, I don't have issues with rats and spilt grain. And I think partly it's the design of the feeders as well, how much ends up on the ground.
Right.
So I'm not sure I have any practical advice beyond, things that will stop the rats and mice climbing up and not hanging them from trees, for example, where it is easier to climb up. And I certainly would advise strongly not to leave spilt grain on the ground too long because of vermin coming in and the consequences of that.
So yeah, thank you. And then so a couple of people mentioned about urban gulls and the feeding of gulls. Is that something that you've kind of looked at all or got any thoughts on?
No, I think you need to be somewhere slightly less landlocked. I mean, we do get gulls, of course, and gulls are everywhere. We don't anybody be brave enough to call them seagulls these days. So you get gulls everywhere. It's in gardens where we are, they're not coming in, and generally that tends to be more heavily urbanized areas, I think.
Right. Yeah.
And I think there was a group I want to say it was in Newcastle that have been looking at this. I think there's some really interesting questions about how the food that goes into the gulls ends up getting deposited as they move around, because they can kind of fertilize certain areas with resource that perhaps they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting thinking about these, it's not just a kind of confined system, because you've got, birds obviously quite mobile, so things could be moving in quite a wide area. You mentioned a bit about clutch size and that the impact of it, kind of looking at the impact on that. And somebody asked about whether the survival rates are better in smaller clutches, so that it's not just about the clutch size, but the survival rate that determines, kind of the long-term impact. So is there anything you could kind of add about that?
From the study we did on nests, we found that survival was it correlated with the number of eggs that were in the nest. And I mean, anybody who's done undergraduate zoology or ecology will know about Lack clutch sizes. So David Lack was this scientist who worked back in the 40s in Oxford, and he showed very nicely how clutch size is associated with fitness, and birds adapt it to the amount of resource available. And my take is that urban areas just generally don't have enough insects to really maintain the young that perhaps would be found elsewhere. Not enough wrong kind of trees and so on to feed insects. And
then finally, we're running out of time. There's somebody who wants to ask a question in person. I'll come to next. That's Gavin. Just before that, you were talking about replacing of lawns, and there was a little bit of discussion in the chat about what plants would be good replacements for grass lawns. Have you got any particular suggestions? Because I think a couple of people were thinking about their own particular gardens of what they might do.
Yeah, we did. This was a massive piece of work, and we ended up with about 50 different plant species, a mix of native and introduced species. It's really hard work to do that, to introduce these. You've got to essentially, remove all the grass and then plant everything in plugs. And but once it's in there, it works really well. You can use it like you play football on it. I'm sure it's absolutely robust, and you can mow it. So it's really pretty, but you can mow it and it looks like a lawn. But it's hard work. The person who I did this with has published a book in it. The Royal Horticultural Society I think it still has a website on it. And what was the name of it? Is it Allendale Park in London? We had a display there. The park authorities put one in about 4 or 5 years ago. But I mean, I would say that what you're looking for are things that grow not much taller than that can cope with being mown. That would be the advice. But if people are interested, drop me an email and I'll send you the papers that have the list of species we worked on.
That's lovely. Okay, so we'll be okay if I kind of just let people if they contact us, we can give them your email, and yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm going to go to Gavin. I think you're unmuted. Would you like to ask your question, Gavin?
Hello, yes, this is me.
Hello.
I apologise because I've got a weird visual impairment. I can only see the right half of everything. Makes it very difficult to type, so I can't do it in the chat box.
That's no problem.
Okay, thank you very much for allowing me to do this. Okay, I learned that the disease, sorry for the pronunciation wrong, trichomosis was what wiped out a lot of the greenfinches. Is that right?
That's right.
Well, yeah. A lot of people, certainly I used to feed peanuts through these metal mesh feeders. And I'm sure that must spread the disease because it makes them blistered around the beak and eyes, doesn't it? And throat, and it's very contagious. So surely when they're pecking through a metal mesh, that's going to aggravate their wounds, and the next bird that comes to feed from that feed is surely going to get all their pus, excuse the graphic detail, but I've seen pictures of these birds. They look awful when they're infected. And surely if they're all pecking from the same mesh, it's absolutely ridiculously going to surely spread the disease.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly the evidence for the importance of feeders is there. It clearly there is a link. The question is, of our feeders, how dirty are feeders? If you've got an infected bird, I think you're absolutely right that the chance of passing it on is there. But in normal circumstances, I didn't talk about it here because it's quite complicated, but we use what's called next generation sequencing to work out the bacteria that are on bird feeders. So this is a very modern technique that allows you to screen for so many pathogens at the same time. And we had feeders out and different types of feeders. We were finding so little evidence of pathogens on the feeders, and what we were mainly finding was just the sort of environmental, soil bacteria and leaf bacteria and so on. I think that the reality is, anytime you get a high density of any species, whether it's people and COVID, or whether it's birds and feeder disease coming together, hygiene is really important. So my advice strongly is that if you are feeding birds, if you choose to feed birds, do wash your feeders regularly. That's the way to avoid it. But the evidence isn't as strong as you'd think. I mean, that I'm trying to remember the name of the eye disease that affects. Oh gosh, it's a finch in eastern US, and the relationship there between feeding on bird feeders and the spread of the disease is much stronger than the evidence with greenfinches. Even though I personally think it is feeders where they're coming together. So yeah, so I think the only advice I can give is if people are choosing to feed, make sure you wash your feeders regularly.
Thank you. And we're going to just finish off this. Liz, I'm not sure it's Liz or Kennedy. Would you like to just ask the final question before we wrap up?
Thanks very much. I'm afraid it's me, Kennedy here, Maria. I wanted to ask whether you control for double counting of the kites by your observers doing it all simultaneously. How do you know it's the same, not the same kites, is the obvious question.
Absolutely. So the way we did it is there's standard ways of measuring raptor numbers. So we followed those techniques, and essentially you drive at a steady speed, which is just under 30 miles an hour, following speed limits, and you're driving through, which means that the chance of you double counting a bird and it catching up with you is remarkably slim. So that's how we avoid that. I mean, if there are different ways of doing it, we had hoped to get a whole series of volunteers to do point counts, so we all would count immediately at the same time all across the area, but getting hundreds of people together who are willing to stand out for days and just every 30 minutes count how many kites they could see wasn't there. So yeah, so
the driving
we just use the sort of standard techniques that people are doing bird of prey censuses use.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure we could go on for another hour, but we're going to have to pull things to a halt now. But thank you so much, Mark. That was a really fantastic talk. And there's a lot of positive comments coming through in the chat about how engaging and thought-provoking people have found it. I'm just going to